older brother. Immediately, Wanli hurries to their parents to announce his return. Qianli tells his parents of Bailey's passing and how he's now promoted to company commander. Since their family was granted a piece of land, Qianli gives his mother money to construct a house in hopes of them living a comfortable future. Later in the evening, a couple of messengers arrives looking for the commander. They notify Qianli that his leave is cancelled and that he should report the next day. In the morning, Qianli bids farewell to his parents. Wanli informs his brother that he too wants to fight, but the older brother wants him to stay. Soon, Qianli leaves the fishing village. On September 15, 1950, the U.S. fleet continues to barrage bombardments into enemy territory while hundreds of U.S. attack planes drop bombs indiscriminately. On the ground below, the sounds of the alarm for the air raid echo throughout the vicinity, and people scramble in search of cover. Soon after, thousands of U.S. tanks and infantry along with other military trucks are deployed on the beach, indicating the start of the advance. The 31st Infantry, also known as the Polar Bears, relax and check on their equipment. Hours later, General MacArthur, the Supreme Commander, talks to his men and the press that the advance to take Seoul back will be fast and should be over by Thanksgiving. The following month at Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong meets with his upper echelon of the Chinese Communist Party to hear reports and updates on the Western advance. Later, Peng, a high-ranking official, arrives at the Library of Chrysanthemum Fragrance. Ennying, Mao's son, greets him and leads Peng to his father. Next, Peng and Mao plan their moves in aiding the Koreans in the war until early the next day. When Peng is about to leave, Ennying tries to convince Peng to let him join the war. He refuses, but Mao gives his blessing. Days later, the U.S. forces drop bombs on the 38th parallel before moving in, and with the Yalu River next to them, Mao appoints Peng as the commander-chief of the Volunteer Army. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army generals in the field subtlety question General MacArthur regarding the advance. But the charismatic general somewhat diverts the questions and gives orders to continue with the attack. At the Volunteer HQ in Korea, Ennying reports to Peng about the current movements of the enemy. They predicted that the U.S. would do a pincer attack on Lake Changjin, and to counter this, Peng planned to stop Meade and stop the U.S. in their advance with his army in strategic positions. Mao learns of Peng's plan and tries to reinforce the Eastern Front with the 9th Corps of the Volunteer Army. The whole 9th Corps assembles and an argument ensues between Qianli's 7th Company and the Artillery Battalion. Fortunately, it broke off after the commander of the 9th Corps, Song Shilan, arrives and start praising Qianli for his company's bravery. Later, he then makes a speech that a boy asked him to be enlisted in the army, and when asked for the reason why, the boy simply replied that their family was given land and that a threat looms to take that away for them, and so, he's there to defend it. Later, Qianli finds out that the boy that Song was talking about is his younger brother, Wanli. The company commander drags his younger bro into an alley where he starts questioning him. The reason he and their deceased brother Bailey volunteered for the army is so that Wanli doesn't have to. Since Wanli's already there and in full uniform, Qianli has no choice but to admit Wanli to his company. Soon, the Chinese army prepares to depart for the front lines. The trains are loaded with all the supplies needed and the men boards them later on. A red flare lights up the evening sky, indicating that the train is about to depart. The brothers rush to the train and made it just in time. As the train leaves, the remaining soldiers give them a snappy salute, knowing full well that many of them will not make it back. On the train, Qianli introduces his younger brother to platoon leader, Lei. Wanli asks Lei where's his gun, but since he's not yet a full-pledged soldier, he wasn't given one. The men start teasing Wanli and only stopped when Qianli arrives. Soon, a weapon-presenting ceremony was supposed to be given to Wanli, but due to the troubles he caused, it was cancelled. In response, Wanli tries to get out of the train but is stopped. Just as the train doors opened, it shows the Great Wall of China. Later that night, Lei hands Wanli his weapons and tells him to rest. But Wanli insisted to continue his punishment. Soon they arrive at the eastern station near the border where the troops resupply. The temperature dropped where Qianli asked the station master with some padded uniforms in hopes of keeping his men warm. The station master asked them to stay for 2 days and everyone will be given one after a resupply. But suddenly, an alarm sounded off when a scout plane passes by. Qianli then orders his men to move and the soldiers start scrambling and grabbing the padded uniforms available. Later, the train stops due to some obstacle on the tracks, and they hear enemy planes fast approaching. Qianli and 2 others go over to check it out and they see US planes bombing the bridge and the train tracks to smithereens. The Chinese soldiers below start unloading supplies from the train, grabbing whatever they can, and start spreading out towards the mountains. The plane gets closer, drops the bombs, and destroys the train along with a few casualties. Subsequently, without any choice, the troops trek the mountainous region towards their objective. They come across a rocky area where they pretend to be dead when two attack planes scout the area. The US pilots don't notice the soldiers below and start shooting randomly at the ground for a bet. The 7th Company endures the slaughter until the plane moves out of the area. Soon after, a US general on a helicopter scouts the snowy mountains for the enemies. Despite flying low, they fail to see the camouflaged soldiers below. In the cover of darkness, the 7th Company continues moving towards their assigned position when they stumble upon a skirmish. Their comrades weren't going to hold out for long. Qianli decides to join the fray and assist their fellows. They position themselves to surprise the enemy. A bomb is detonated, signaling the attack. A fierce firefight ensues, and for the young Wanli, it's his baptism of fire. The battle goes on, and the Americans were not making it easy for the Chinese. The Americans with their superior firepower pin the Chinese, but their tenacity overwhelms the foreign invaders. Qianli together with Wanli and another soldier gets into close quarter combat with the enemy. There Wanli gets his first kill. Later, the Chinese take control of a US tank and face off with an enemy tank. The two tanks a few meters from each other fire at the same time. The shell skids at each other but manage to hit the enemy tank, making it explode. Lei's platoon sees an incoming enemy reinforcement and decides to stop them. With strategic positioning, Lei's platoon annihilates the Americans. Eventually, the 7th Company manages to blow up the communication tower, win the battle and live to see another day. At the US airport on the Eastern Front, General Amund, in charge of the Western Front, meets with General Oliver Smith. General Amund is rather aggressive in questioning his counterpart's decision of his slow approach in the advance. General Smith argues that his selection is essential, knowing that it's not the fast-paced war that General MacArthur hoped for. Back in the mountains, the 7th Company continues with their march until they reach the forward camp. The commanding officer welcomes the troops with open arms after seeing their state. Qianli successfully delivers the radio transmitters along with the code ciphers. Finally, the men get to rest and eat their fill, or so they thought. Anying enters the barracks to deliver some clothes, and after handing them out, gives the orders to Qianli to move for another mission. Without hesitation or complaints, the men prepare to leave. In the dead of night, with temperatures dropping below zero, the 9th Corps heads to Lake Changjin. Back at the Frontlines HQ, the general just knew that the men marching on the front lines doesn't have any padded uniforms to endure the cold, and ordered his men to find a way for them to deliver them. Later, the soldiers take a rest in the mountains, enduring fatigue, hunger, and the cold. Showing camaraderie through thick and thin. Meanwhile, the US soldiers enjoy hefty hot chow prepared for the holidays. Then General Smith receives a report that with no signs of the enemy, they receive signal interference every time the planes cross a certain area. At the Frontlines HQ, the alarm blares and the communists starts evacuating to the shelters, grabbing everything they can. Anying together with a friend goes back to one of the small buildings to secure a large-scale map. But the planes are already on top of them and dropping bombs. The fire went out and there is no sign of any survivors, and young Anying is martyred. At Lake Changjin on the Eastern Front, the US 31st Infantry Regiment, also known as the Polar Bears, prepares to move its HQ. While multiple Chinese volunteer army companies positions nearby, monitoring the radio and enemy movements. On the night of November 27th, the general assault begins with PVA soldiers storming the US 31st Infantry Regiment's fortifications at Sinhung-ni. In hand-to-hand fighting, one volunteer soldier kills 3 Americans, while another drives a seized truck along a column of American trucks, firing grenades into and destroying 2 of them, and then igniting further explosives between 2 tanks, wrecking them. Qianli destroys a tank by rolling underneath it and attaching a demolition device to it, while Wanli disables another tank by throwing a grenade into it. After the fierce, relentless, and overwhelming assault, the Americans begin to withdraw. In the middle of the firefight, Qianli wounds Colonel Alan McLean, a US colonel in charge of the Polar Bears. In a state of bloodlust, Wanli tries to execute the officer, but his brother stops him and drills the proper morals of war into his head. Reinforcements have been dispatched to Sinhung-ni from Hagaru-ri. A plane attacks Chinese forces and drops a smoke marker, but it is shot down by a volunteer soldier with a bazooka, crashing into the base. The base is subsequently attacked by US bombers, and in a heroic effort to save his comrades and lessen their casualties, Lei places the smoke marker in a jeep and drives away, following the retreating US column, baiting the bombers. After the commotion, Lei is seen crushed beneath the jeep. Qianli adds Lei Suisheng's name to his list of 7th Company soldiers killed, swearing that he will win the war and bring his troops home and to their families. The retreating Marines column comes upon a group of PVA soldiers who have frozen to death fulfilling their duties as sentries. Despite being enemies, General Smith couldn't help but salutes them for their bravery and conviction, remarking that fighting against such strong-willed warriors was not meant for the US to win. The movie ends with a US graveyard at Hungnam during the evacuation, with the city burning in the distance, and then injured Americans being evacuated and victorious Chinese forces advancing and celebrating. By the 24th